Hey everyone, and welcome to Bright and Early, the podcast for people building early stage startups. I'm your host, Brian Ray. I talk to entrepreneurs, product people, designers, and marketing pros to learn what works, what doesn't, and why, giving you at least one thing to apply to your business first thing tomorrow. My guest today is Marie Prokopets. Marie is a co-founder of FYI, a service that helps you find all your documents in 3 clicks or less. That sounds nice. Marie speaks and writes extensively about remote work, and I'm looking forward to discussing some best practices with her today. Marie, welcome to Bright and Early.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure to have you on. I reached out because I had read this article of yours, 11 Best Practices for Working Remotely. I think it has just so much practical and useful advice in it. I think it'll just kind of provide the outline and structure for this interview quite flawlessly. But before that, would love to hear a little bit more about FYI and what you've got going on there.
Yeah, of course. I'm happy to share. And thanks again for enjoying my article. It was actually one of the most popular ones that we've written. So happy that you enjoyed it.
It's easy to see.
In terms of FYI, yeah, thanks. In terms of FYI, it is a product that helps you find your documents in 3 clicks or less. And we're actually adding some great new features to make this more of a team product that's all about kind of team collaboration and works for an entire company. So I've been with my fully remote team busy at work building all those features recently. And yeah, we're really excited about solving the problem of finding documents and finding information and seeing what people are doing within a company and really kind of helping foster collaboration.
Okay. And you co-founded FYI with Heaton Shaw of Kissmetrics fame and, well, just general Twitter fame generally.
Yeah,
so
the illustrious Heaton Shaw.
Yes, right, right. So how did when was FYI intended to be a remote first company from the beginning, or how did that conversation go, and how have you added remote people to the team as you've gone along?
Yeah, so it's actually interesting. My background is very kind of corporate and outside of tech. So as of about 3.5 years ago, I was actually working at a big conglomerate. It was an alcohol company, and before that, I was a consultant at one of the largest consulting firms. And I never worked remotely. I didn't even know it was a possibility. like I thought you had to go to an office every day and be there in person and kind of have your days structured for you, almost like you're in school. And you're not supposed to be bad, or you're to get, put in the corner or get a bad grade. But yeah, I was completely used to being in an office. And then I moved to San Francisco. I actually moved here. Originally, I was living in Napa. I got brought over by the company I used to work at to run wine innovation, which is as glamorous as it sounds. It was very fun. And then I ended up moving to San Francisco because living, a single person with a small dog in a vineyard, it was cool, but then it kind of got a little bit boring and isolating. And so I moved over to San Francisco, and that's when I started to learn more about remote work and get really kind of into the tech culture. And I met Heaton when I was just meeting with a startup and kind of exploring opportunities and just giving them some advice. And Heaton was an advisor there. And we ended up obviously building a few products together before FYI that they were in the document space, but they weren't really grounded in research. And it just wasn't solving the right problem for customers. And those were actually all fully remote teams. So we actually never considered, and so is FYI, we never considered, starting with an office first. Okay. First of all, we're both in the San Francisco Bay Area, and it's really expensive, first of all, to have an office here. And second of all, and obviously it ties you to talent who's here as well. And there's a cost associated with that too, of course, because, living in a major city, you obviously need to make a certain level of money. But it wasn't just that, we really wanted access to talent that was all over the world. And there was no other way to kind of get that and get that kind of flexibility than with remote work. So Yeah, we built it. It was like there was no other option, essentially. And for me, I was like, holy shit, like there's this whole remote work phenomenon that I didn't know about, and it opens up so many opportunities. Like, why would we do anything else?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's kind of where we started and where we still are. We're, of course, always open to changes as things are required for a business. But I think there are plenty of great examples of businesses that have scaled that are still remote, even when they have hundreds of people. So yeah, I think remote first, and you know, we're remote fans, but we're not what I say, we wouldn't like die in a sword over remote, but we both really love remote. And I don't think my co-founder, Heaton has been a remote worker for I think about 15 years. And he had one startup with an office, but they were still kind of also partly remote. So I don't think he knows any other way.
Yeah.
So that's another thing. Yeah.
And how many people do you have on the team now, and where are they in the world?
Yeah, we've got about 10, and we have an interesting structure where we have a mix of in-house people and dev shops and people who are kind of more part-time on the marketing side.
Mm-hmm.
And they are all over the place. So Heaton, myself, and our CTO are all in the Bay Area. And that doesn't mean we meet, you know, all the time. So we're all either working from home most of the time, or like in coffee shops. I'm a member of the wing. So I work out of there sometimes. Then we've got folks in Canada. We have folks in Uruguay, Portugal, and I know I'm missing a few. Oh, other parts of the U.S. too. So we're pretty spread out. Yeah, and somehow the time zone stuff all works. So that's been really wonderful and surprising. Mm-hmm. But yeah, we're all over the place.
Well, so this article that you wrote, and you're saying before we started recording, it's like one of your, or maybe we had started recording, but it's like one of your most famous or your most popular pieces of content that you've created so far. And so what I'd like to do is just kind of go through that, those 11 best practices, but you open it up, kind of introducing that you surveyed 500 remote workers and identified, you know, some common challenges around communication, the potential lack of social opportunities, and loneliness and isolation. Loneliness and isolation is of particular interest to me. We can maybe get into that a little bit later. But in response to those three challenges, the first best practice that you recommend is practicing good meeting etiquette, which is to say, if one person is remote, then everyone is remote. Talk more about that. What is it that made you add that to the list?
Yeah, absolutely. So you kind of alluded to it. We did a survey of about 500 people, and it wasn't just people who work remotely. It was people who are either remote workers, just not remote workers, or people who, you know, are in an office, but they work with remote workers. And we also got about 200 tips from people as well about specifically how they deal with the challenges of remote work, what are their best practices. And from that, also, I forgot to mention, we did some tweets, and we had I dug through thousands and thousands of responses from people, replies on Twitter. So we had all this kind of really brilliant context. And what I did was I then boiled it down to these 11 best practices. So essentially what's in this post and what I'm going to talk about is, it's not just like the world according to me, because then it would probably be more boring. It's the world according to so many people, thousands of people who are working remotely, who are either, you know, struggling with it and have found solutions, or people who haven't really found solutions but shared their kind of challenges. So this just really encapsulates insights literally from thousands of people. And the reason that I started with meetings is, you mentioned that communication is the number one challenge that remote workers have. And there are a lot of ways to have bad meetings in a remote environment, and that only intensifies and worsens that communication problem. And I think the other aspect of it too is that there is kind of inherent loneliness and isolation that happens when you're working at home in your apartment, as I am, as you are, Brian. And meetings are like one of our ways to kind of get out of that, because we have some of that human interaction. Right. But yeah, if you're if you're just, having these meetings with like your video off and you're like totally checked out and you're working on other stuff and
wandering
it's
around the
disorganized, like,
kitchen.
oh, exactly.
Yeah.
Petting your dog, which I mean, sometimes you need to do that during the meetings if they're stressful.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're not having a really good remote work experience. So that's why I started there. And just in terms of, what you can do to make remote meetings really good, I think turning on the video it's such a simple thing, but it's really invaluable because one, you can't actually tune out. People can see you. They can see that, she's on her cell phone, or, he's like eating peanut butter out of a jar, in the kitchen. That's weird. Or, they're typing on their computer. So once you turn on the video, it kind of forces you to be present. Just like if you were in an office and, you were in the meeting, like you're forced to be present. You're forced to participate and listen. I do remember back when I was in these offices, like I would see some of the execs grab their phone and start spacing out and start like looking at emails. And then you're like, okay, shit, I have to improve, what I'm saying or get them involved somehow. Yeah. So again, it's like, you actually can see who's tuning out too. You can kind of make sure that you reel everybody back in. Yeah. So that's one thing that's really important. I think also having everyone on separate screens is a really good practice. And the reason is you just are all kind of on the same like level playing field. So instead of having like 3 people in one room and everybody else remote, it just makes everybody feel, the remote people or fully remote people, it just makes them feel like, okay, we're all basically remote. And I think it also it's the same opportunity to speak, like everybody can take turns instead of in a room where sometimes some people in a room, they get into a conversation and the people who are on screens, it's just tough to kind of get into that. I think also you obviously don't want to kind of work on other stuff or fiddle with your phone or do anything that's pulling you away from the meeting. And then I think agendas they're so valuable to have in a non-remote meeting that, like, why wouldn't you bring that into a remote meeting?
For sure. Yeah.
And since communication is such an issue too, I think it's so essential to write down notes and to share them in Slack or however, the team works. Because then nothing gets lost in translation. It's really frequent where in a meeting, something gets decided and maybe it doesn't get documented, but in an office, it's really easy to just go walk up to someone and say, hey, what happened? Or you just really discover that there was a miscommunication early, but with remote work, it's so easy for that miscommunication to go on for weeks. So documenting is really important. And same with like action items and who owns them. So yeah, I think for us, like recently, we've actually had some interesting things that weren't in this article where we realized we needed special Slack channels where like something gets decided in a meeting, for example, like what's shipping to customers. We talk about it in the meeting, but then maybe it's not fully clear. So we always document after, for example, our daily engineering stand-ups, we document it in a Slack channel so that everybody knows what's shipping. And then once it gets shipped, it's communicated there too. So that again, you just have as clear communication as possible and no one can kind of miss out in terms of people who want to stay abreast of what's happening. And also there just won't be miscommunications.
Yeah. Yeah. And you mentioned clear communication later in the article. And I think the interesting thing too about, just switching on video and making calls video by default, not only does it, encourage that engagement like you're talking about, but body language in person is so important. And you're already losing a lot of it just by being faces on a screen. But to imagine losing both body language and facial expression just feels like you're losing so much. So the next thing that you mentioned is
and I was going to say we actually don't. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say you and I are right now. We're not on video because my internet is having issues. The great San Francisco internet is not working for me today really well. But yeah, I mean, there is a lot. You're right. There is a lot that gets lost when you can't see kind of how someone's sitting, how they're receiving the information. All you hear is kind of the tone of their voice. So I think that's spot on.
It's huge. This second one, this is one that I actually kind of struggle with. So I'm curious to have a conversation here is you say experiment with what makes you most productive. The best way to escape this trap is to experiment, to find the best way you work. Give yourself permission to try different start times, work from different places, wear different types of clothes. That makes sense in the sense of like there are so many variations of remote work. Do you mean working from home? Do you mean co-working, like from a coffee shop? There's so many variations. So it makes sense that you ought to experiment and find what works. The struggle that I have in that, Marie, is that I have found it difficult to get myself into a routine. So what are your thoughts on how to balance experimenting with what works versus, one great thing about the office is that where you're going and when, and your brain and body just get into this, rhythm, whether it wants to or not. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's fascinating. So I'm a person like you that likes routine, and I do sometimes miss the routine of going into an office at, whatever time. I'm not a good morning person, but I would always be there between like 9 and 10. But like, you get there at a certain point, you have lunch at a certain point, you have meetings, and then you leave at a certain point.
Yep.
And of course, like people are seeing you, they're watching you. So, you have to dress a certain way and act a certain way. And it's almost like there's too much freedom when you're home and there's no structure and you have to decide it.
Yeah.
But the problem with that though is there's actually better ways to work for each individual, right? Like you might be way more of a morning person. I mean, I like I said, I'm really not, but like our CTO, for example, he gets up, he starts working at 5 a.m., which is not how I would do it, but that's his thing, right? Like he is most productive at 5 a.m. and he has this big block of time between like 5 and 9 where he can just get a bunch done. No one's interrupting him. Well, that's not true, but he mentally feels like at least me and Heaton are around, so we're not interrupting him. I think that's probably it, because other people are around. But it's like there's so much freedom that you can actually find your best way of working. And I don't think that if he worked in an office, he could really get there at 5 a.m. I mean, adding in the commute, and people might think it's weird. Like, maybe he wants to leave earlier. And then do work later. It's like you have all this flexibility, and it's up to you to use it in the best way. So I think that's one reason to experiment is just find the best way that you work. Is it really early in the morning? Is it working later? Is it, in your pajamas, which I personally don't think works, but some people that works really well.
Yeah.
Is it, exactly. Is it from a coffee shop? I know for me, the problem with routine is if I get in the same routine every day from a remote work perspective, I'll go insane. And the problem is like I get stir crazy. So if I'm sitting at home every day and my routine is, I get up a certain time, I start work a certain time, and then I end at a certain time and I'm home, I'll just go insane. It's like not enough being outside of the house.
Yeah. Yes.
So I can't have the same routine. I need when I need it, I need to be able to go work out of the house, and I don't know when that'll be. So that's like what works for me, right? Which could be totally different from you, which is you need a routine and you need to figure out what that good routine is. So yeah, that's basically how I think about it. And I think in terms of the tips that a lot of people shared, there was just some really funny stuff. Like some people actually found that if you pretend to leave your house and then you come back in, that's going to help make them productive because somehow it kind of demarcates work. I think, that's in the article. I mean, it's funny that I can see how that kind of mental trick would make someone more productive. And I think the other thing too is if someone's starting out and they're kind of new to remote work, it really does take a couple months to get used to it and get kind of to your peak productivity. And the reason is you need to figure out what's best, because maybe you go into it thinking, oh, the best way to work is I just do what I always did in an office job, but I'm just at home. And then you realize really quickly, oh gosh, that doesn't work for me. I actually need to get up and exactly. I need to get up. I used to go get up and, go to get a coffee and like walk with coworkers and stop by desks. But now I just realized I sit at my desk. So I need to build in a walk. or I need like this kind of music, or wow, now that I don't have a cafeteria at work, I'm eating really crappy food. And so I need to kind of adjust that. So to me, it's like just a learning process in the beginning until someone figures out the best way. And honestly, that might change too over time. So you might realize like your dog is interrupting you too much, like mine tends to do, and you need to spend more time working out of the house. So I don't know if that helped you, because I know you said you have some challenges, but
no. It makes sense. I think the thing that I'm trying to sort out is I know the things that work well for me. I know the things that don't. And it's just a matter of making a decision and sticking to it, like creating my own routine. So yeah, it's I mean, like so many things with remote work, a bunch of the responsibility does fall on the on the worker to follow through with
that's the scary part, is there are bad habits. I know I have a ton. Like one I'm doing right now, we're recruiting for 3 engineering roles, and so I am so kind of like fully on top of that, and obviously, shipping product to customers and all that I'm working like crazy hours and doing it every day in a row and not taking enough time to get out of the house.
Yeah.
And I know that's a bad habit.
Yeah.
And I'm still doing it because there's no one really to say like, hey, Marie, you should, or interruption of like, I'm going to go get a coffee down, talk to some coworkers. It doesn't exist. It's just me in my apartment. It's stressing.
Yeah.
So I know after this podcast, I'm going to go take a nice walk. I don't care how much work I have. I need to do it so I don't crash.
Hey, listeners. We'll get back to the interview in just a second, but this is a great time to pause and let you know that Bright and Early is brought to you by Transistor.fm. Transistor offers you professional podcast hosting and analytics. They host this very podcast, and listen, y'all, it could not be any easier. Product is ridiculously easy to use. If you've got a question, Justin and John, the guys behind the software, are super responsive. I've needed to reach out a time or two for some help. They were all over it. So if you're thinking about starting a podcast for your business, just pop on over to Transistor.fm and let them know that Brian sent you. Well, that leads us right into the next one I want to talk about, which is creating boundaries between work and life. And this is a tricky one. One of the benefits that gets pumped up about remote work is that it turns out managers are concerned that their workers aren't going to that they're not going to get their work done and that they're going to abuse it. But the numbers show that remote workers are actually, they work longer hours and they take less sick days, and so over time that's obviously it's detrimental. So this thing about creating boundaries between work and life, what did you all see from the responses, and what sort of tips did folks suggest?
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned people work longer hours. It's interesting. We actually did something that's called remote work statistics. Just use FYI /remote-work-statistics. And there are so many statistics about productivity. And you're totally right. The fear is, people work remotely, they're not going to be productive. The reality is they're more productive. They take fewer breaks. They actually have fewer sick days because they're not exposed to all the germs in an office, which is crazy, but true. Yeah. And probably they're not as stressed. So they're actually like less sick as a result of that. And they're actually in a quieter work environment, or just an environment that works better for them. So they because of that are more productive. But yeah, I think one of the most common things that we heard from people, again, whether it was via Twitter, the survey, or the tips, is it's really tough when you're working at home, especially to have a start and an end time for work. Yeah. And I know I do this. I don't know about you, but first thing I wake up, I grab my phone, I start looking. It's not very mindful. I'm very into meditation and mindfulness, and I'm breaking all of it with this. Yeah. Grab my phone, start reading these things, start slacking. Then I get out of bed and I'm just on my phone, even while I'm like making breakfast or brushing my teeth. And then, you jump into it and then it just never ends. And that is a challenge for people because it's really easy to burnout. And I know like he does not take vacation. It's maybe someone will listen to this and tell him to do it, but he doesn't. I can't get him to really. He doesn't like vacations himself. Like he doesn't care, obviously, vacations for people on the team, but himself, he just can't do it. So, and even if he does go somewhere, he's working. So yeah, it's really tough because it's like work and life lines get completely blurred. So there are definitely some tips people mentioned. One that I think the buffer team actually, a few of them had mentioned it, is just time blocking the day. There's a start time, there's an end time, and you follow that. So I think that really helps. I personally couldn't do that, but I don't know. I think it's very healthy to do that. It's just some people are kind of more workaholics than others, and I had this issue before remote work. So another one is really having like a separate space from work. So I work everywhere in my apartment, so I'm not good at this. But it seems, do you have an office and like a separate closed off office?
Well, I'm at my co-working space right now. But I do have an office at home as well that I work from.
That's good.
When I'm working from
home.
home.
So if you have a place you can leave and you're not going back in, that is a way to kind of have a container for work. Another one that some people mentioned is just turn off your phone notifications. Again, I can't do that. It's not in my nature, but it's very healthy. I remember at one point I turned off the buzzing. So that can be good. I can't do that again, but I used to do that. So that's something you should do.
Yeah.
We talked about like a separate office or a separate space for working where that's your work zone. Well, why don't you put your cell phone in there or put your computer in there and don't touch it? So that gives you that space from the technology too. Someone else had a really funny one, which is they had like work slippers or work shoes that they would put on. And when they're wearing them, that's when they're in work mode. And when they're not wearing them, they're not allowed to work. So I think that's actually really nice to kind of split things up for your brain. And then I mentioned the one about somebody would leave the house and come back in, and then leave the house again and come back in.
That one I really like. Because the thing that I find, and I've even tried to set timers for myself to be like, if I'm going to quit working at 5, well, actually, quit working at 4:50 and pretend that just walking out of the house up and down the neighborhood for 10 minutes and then coming back in the house is the commute. Because like if I am working from home, then like the rapid context switching between like 1 minute I'm thinking about how to advise a client that like their best option might be to sell their business for parts, like something that is giving me some stress. And then 30 seconds later, and like a short walk up the stairs, my kiddo is asking about, her history project. And like when there's no commute, there's no buffer. The great thing about remote work is that we don't have to commute anymore. That's fantastic. One of the upsides of it though, is that it gives you a little bit of time to, separate the two, to create some boundaries there. So I really like I like that funny little thing of just walking in and out of the door. Distinguishes.
I do too. I love. Yeah. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh no. That's all.
I think what you're saying about taking a walk. It makes me realize that it's really just a mindset, right? It's like, what can you do to bring yourself into okay, I'm done with work and I'm now in kind of relaxation mode, or I'm dealing with family stuff. And I think that's a great one. If I had time, I would add it to this of taking a walk, add it to the article. But yeah, I think what can people do to switch their mindset? And that's what vacations do a lot. It's like, okay, I'm in the vacation mindset, but do you really need to wait until you go on vacation to get in that mindset? I don't think so.
Right.
I'm going to try this walk thing. I'm going to do it.
Yeah. Well, okay. I've got more thoughts on that, but I want to hit some of these other. I want to hit some of these other points. We'll have to do two. We'll have to do 2 episodes.
I know there's so much to talk about.
But this, I think that this one, you say make yourself visible at work. That is so important. Because it is you miss like the serendipitous moments when you're in a co-located space of just conversations come up and things get shared and conversations happen. So this idea about how to be visible as a remote worker, tell your manager what you're working on, tell your team what you're working on, What were you hearing from the respondents, and any particular stories around this issue?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I mentioned that people are more productive when they work remotely.
Yeah.
Well, actually, even though people are not as worried about not getting promoted as remote workers, so I think it's like 60 or 70% of people, when they were asked, they're not that worried that they won't get promoted, and about 23% are really worried about it. And the reality is, it looks like there are fewer kind of career advancement opportunities offered to people who work remotely. And that's probably more for companies where part of people are remote and part of them are in an office.
Mm-hmm.
So like, for a company that everybody is remote, that's a little bit different. But yeah, there actually are currently some kind of negative effects for remote work, unless you become really visible and kind of make yourself known.
Yeah.
So yeah, like in a company, you can have the elevator ride with the CEO or somebody
Right.
exactly, and talk to them. People see you every day, but yeah, as a remote worker, it's really easy to just, the people don't even know what's happening, right? Maybe your manager does, maybe they don't, but then how about the rest of the team? So yeah, there were a lot of things we heard where people would say, well, one thing that they like to do is just respond right away in Slack to just show that they're around. So if somebody asks a question, either a general one or of that specific person, they just get on Slack right away and respond. I mean, there's a counter argument to that too, of course, which is like, well, if you're working, you're deep in something, you shouldn't necessarily respond right away. So like synchronous versus asynchronous, but that is one thing that a number of people mentioned. Another one was basically to just update people and tell them what you're doing. So maybe set your Slack status and say, hey, I'm working on this thing, or I'm in a meeting, which I think there's actually a Google Calendar app that you can use that just shows right away you're in a meeting. So that kind of thing is, that kind of thing is helpful. Or you just message, maybe there's like a channel where you message and say what you're doing. People also just said, get more time with your manager than you normally would, and just keep them up to date, whether it's in a meeting with a video on or just slacking them.
So I've got a question about this, that, for each of these 11 best practices, it's great advice for the worker. It would also be, good leadership by a manager to, like educate their employees on these things, and, hey, be sure you're doing this. This one in particular struck me as like, it could be challenging for a manager of remote teams to know that it is in our it's in our employees' best interest to be sure that they are visible. But like, it would be kind of hard to facilitate this as a manager without it sounding like, hey, what you working on? What you working on? Show us what you're working on. So
right. Yeah.
Did you run across any suggestions around how to communicate this in a way that feels natural and celebratory rather than Big Brother?
Yeah, I think there's different mechanisms. So some people, what they would do is they set up Slack channels where they talk about, like, kind of celebrate what people have done. So, hey, we just shipped this thing, or hey, we just did this great marketing campaign. Here's who was involved. So that's one mechanism where you're not really like Big Brother, but you're encouraging people to share what they've done. And that really helps make everybody more visible and the team just be happier because they see all this progress that's happening. So that's one thing. There's actually one thing that we do, which is we do daily updates every day. And so everybody in the team in the Slack channel says what they did yesterday and what they plan to do today. And then they keep doing that every day. And that kind of forces transparency and visibility right away. But
it just makes it a natural part of the company process. Like, exactly. This is just how we work. Yeah.
Exactly. So that's the key, is from a manager perspective, I would say the tips were mainly just making it natural through mainly through Slack channels. And I think, as a manager myself, I also want to make sure that I'm not being too micromanagey by asking all the time what's going on. But I think you just have to learn to strike the right balance. And I think remote workers kind of realize that it's not it's not a bad intention when you're like, hey, I just want to know what you're working on, so we're all aligned.
Yeah.
I think they know because it's just a different kind of environment. But yeah, I think you're right. There aren't as many best practices in this for managers. I feel like I need another article where I talk about remote work best practice for managers.
Yeah. No,
but I think another thing that,
across the board.
Yeah. Another thing that actually someone from Dribble had mentioned was really just keep asking, are you getting what you need from me? And make it about the manager and asking them, asking the team member, well, am I giving you enough? And then they can kind of elaborate more about what they're doing and share more about how they feel. And if they're working on the right thing. So that's another way, is just make it about yourself if you're a manager instead of making it about the teammate.
That's really practical. This next one I think is funny because it's schedule time for socializing, which is true. And a phrase that I've seen pop up a whole lot among people discussing remote work is this phrase, planned spontaneity. Like that.
Wow, that's awkward.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Like, but at the same time, it is actually, it's kind of necessary. Like the opportunities for spontaneity and serendipity when you're all, just on the other side of a keyboard, it's just less. And so I'm curious, what the conversation was like, and what you all do at FYI to schedule time for socializing, how that has happened, and what tips you've seen people recommend.
Yeah. So I think one of the funny things that happens, and we heard this over and over again, is people are in the groove of either staying home or not being in an office environment. And that it makes you less likely to get out of the house and do stuff. It's like if you're already, out at an office and you're already all dressed up, it's much easier to go do something, whether it's with the people you work with or the people just that you're friends with, versus if you're home and you're in like your comfortable pants, in a sweatshirt and your dog's cuddled up with you, like you're much less likely to leave the house and see a friend. So people talked about this over and over again, and they just said they literally have to schedule it in. They have to say, okay, I'm one person talked about poker, and they're like, okay, I have poker twice a month and I schedule it in. Other people said they go to like group fitness classes. And that helps them just be around other people. Some people, they actually go to co-working spaces and make friends that way, or join like meetups and Slack groups that are actually with other remote workers. And then there's kind of that bond automatically that happens. So yeah, there's a lot of different ways to do it. It's basically about being purposeful. And sometimes you're lucky, like I'm lucky, and I have friends that'll just be like, hey, like we have to do something. You're busy, like you're doing all this work, you need to get out of the house. But not everybody kind of has that luxury. And also like they might have a lot of friends that are also workaholics. So I think it's just important to schedule time and be really present with yourself. Yeah, exactly. And again, it doesn't have to be seeing friends or seeing people you work with. It can absolutely be like I said, a gym class or just taking a walk where there's a lot of people. It's really this like absence of people that kind of makes you go a little bit loopy. I'm probably not as good at this personally, but FYI, I mean, I encourage the people on the team, like, hey, how are you doing? Like, have you done anything cool this week? Like, there's one particular person that gets in that mode of not leaving and they just stay in their house. And I'm always like, oh, you should go do this or this. I just recommend it. We have that kind of relationship, but it's good as a manager just to watch out too, because it's really easy to slip into that kind of, like I'm in work mode, I'm home. Yeah.
We'll jump forward a little bit. The last one that you mentioned, that I just think is, I mean, it's important generally, but so important when most of us spend our time sitting down at a computer, and that is focus on your health. and you offer some tips there. What are some of those tips that you all have heard or found to be the most helpful if somebody who's just getting started in remote work is going to, try to make a habit of focusing on one for the next 30 days? Is there one in particular that you've seen to be the most helpful or most likely to be adopted?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think just in general, in terms of a healthy lifestyle, when you work in an office, so it's actually easier in some ways to have a healthy lifestyle because one, there's typically like cafeterias right around you or in your office. And two, you're eating with people. So there's kind of that peer pressure of, I don't want to eat this, 2 burgers or whatever it is. So there's that. And there's also, again, the momentum of, I'm already out of the house. It's easy to go to the gym after work or before work.
Totally.
Or during work, because there's a gym in the office, which is for larger buildings, like pretty standard. But the downside, funny enough, is people, I in all the remote staffs work I did, I learned that people eat more snacks, like unhealthy snacks while they're commuting, whether it's like sodas that they're drinking or just chips and stuff. So that's funny. That's like I guess, downside of the healthy or not healthy side of working in an office. But yeah, it's really important to not get sucked into I'm just sitting in my chair all the time and not going anywhere. So I think the most important one for me and what I heard from people was to kind of take some time to get a little bit of movement in, whether that's taking a walk or actually going to the gym and getting some exercise, or just walking around like every half hour, every hour, so that you're not just constantly sitting at your desk. That I would say is the most important, because your brain gets some scenery in, and there's space even for ideas to develop. You're getting obviously exercise and movement. I would say that's the number one most important. And then I think with that, it's nice to just go outside and see some nature.
Yeah. Right, of course.
So if you have the luxury of living somewhere by trees, that's really important. I just read that people who live by trees or parks actually live longer, which is crazy. But that is all the more important to get out into nature. Yeah,
it's interesting because like the walking meeting is had just come so into fashion, and it's a really great way to, rather than the two of us, to sit down and in a conference room across from each other. Hey, let's go for a walk. And then earlier in this conversation, we were saying, what's really important when you have a meeting with your remote worker is to do it by video conference. I wonder if it'd be a fair trade-off to say this meeting we are not going to do by video, because we're both just going to give each other a call and we're going to go for a walk together on the phone.
I think that's really smart.
That'd be a good trade-off.
Let's start a movement. I like that. So I have the new AirPods, and they have that noise canceling function, which is so good. I took this like really long walk. I was talking to Heaton with my dog. I was walking him, and we're having a really great meeting, but it's like nighttime, and I'm in my, I'm like, wow, this is so great. I can't hear anything. And then I told my boyfriend, like, yeah, these new AirPods are so good. And he was like, hold on, Marie. So, it's dangerous to have noise canceling and be walking around at night. Yeah. Like, you could get hit by a car, or somebody like jumps you. I mean, we live in San Francisco, so that could happen. Yeah. And I was just like, oh. So I would say, I would just add, walk with caution. If you have the new AirPods, context, put on the noise, turn off the noise canceling.
Always very important.
Yeah, but I love that idea. Yeah. I think you're totally right. Walking remote meetings. I want to try that, or more of it, and do it safely.
So one final question is kind of it's a meta question across this whole thing, which is, everything that we've just listed there, best practices. The article is called 11 Best Practices for Working Remotely. It could also be called 11 Best Practices for Working. Like, have good meeting etiquette, take care of yourself. You know what I mean? So but it is also obvious and very apparent that this sort of resource and guide is necessary because remote work is different. So
Mm-hmm.
in general, do you think that being productive while working remotely is harder than being productive when working in an office?
Good
Or
question.
at least let me ask you, do you think it requires more maturity?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
That's a funny. Yeah, I think so. The first way you asked the question, I was weighing all the trade-offs because I
Yeah.
remember when I was in an office and just in general, people have chit chat and they like, we'll hang out with coworkers and not really talk about anything. And maybe you leave on time. So maybe but then you might not be as productive because you just slacked off part of the day. And it's really common for people to be on Facebook and stuff when they're at work. So I was weighing all those, but I think when you ask about maturity, I think it does. And the reason it requires more maturity is you're kind of your own boss in terms of how you work. And you can either let your bad habits overrun you and kind of weigh you down, or you can make better choices. So it's kind of the same way of like, should I go to the gym today or not? I personally don't end up doing it enough at all or zero, but I should be. But yeah, it's the same kind of thing. It's like, am I willing to make a few small changes to have a happier, more productive work life?
Yeah.
And yeah, I think that requires maturity. It's not about really age or anything. It requires, yeah. And it requires some, self-awareness too. It requires knowing what the bad habits are and then making is essentially to not have those bad habits.
Yeah.
So I would say remote work, more than maturity, requires some self-awareness, which not everybody has.
Yeah. It makes me wonder about the hiring implications. I think I like the way you answered the question of, is it harder than working in an office? Well, I mean, that depends. Like, what do you mean by hard? And there, whatever. But the maturity, self-awareness, and discipline piece of it, that feels like we can pretty well say that yes. What do you think the hiring implications are? And does it is there a way to interview for those or screen for those in the hiring process?
Yeah, it's interesting. So somebody from Dribble actually had something really, really powerful to say about hiring, and it surprised me. It was like people who are just looking for, like, I'm going to travel the world and work remotely and like mostly have fun. That's not the kind of person that's going to have all those. Not to say that doesn't exist, but that there's a good person that wants those things too. But most likely they're not going to have the self-awareness, discipline, and maturity to want to, carve out the time and have the right habits to work remotely. So if somebody's leading with that, it's like, oh yeah, I love remote work because I can, be a nomad. If that's like their most passionate thing, that's probably somebody that you want to really consider whether or not it's right for your team. Again, like that can be, I've seen people at Buffer that like live in vans, and I think that's really cool and empowering, but I don't think that's the first thing they're like, I want to work at Buffer so I can, travel. It's like, no, I do they want the job because of your company and your values and what you're accomplishing and doing and the skills they're going to learn and how they're going to evolve? Or do they want it to kind of foster a certain lifestyle first and foremost? Yes. So I think that's one thing. And you really do. So like I mentioned, we're hiring for 3 roles, and we definitely like to see people who have had some remote experience. That's helpful because they've already gone through the kind of trials and tribulations and trespasses of remote work and found their way through. So that's something that really helps. Not to say you can't find someone great who can do remote first. Have a remote job first,
right,
and do a good job. But it is nice to have someone with experience. And I think, for me, the first thing that I look for is communication. And so we talked about how communication is the number one challenge for remote work. So really, you need people who are good at communicating, who are doing it often, and who, communicate in a way that kind of fits with the rest of the company culture. So meaning, are you a company that really likes people who are succinct? So then maybe you don't want to hire someone who has like a 10-page, resume or a 10-page cover letter. So another one also is kind of, do they read carefully and then notice screening questions? That's another, to me, it's under communication, but it's kind of comprehension. So we put in things into our job postings where if somebody didn't really pay attention, then they miss it, and they're usually disqualified right away because they didn't really do the application the way that we asked.
Interesting.
So yeah, I guess to summarize, I would say first and foremost, I would recommend looking for someone who's really good at communicating, and whatever that means for the role, right? Because it's different for each role. So like an engineer is going to have a different expectation than someone in PR, just as an example. And then, do they have some remote work experience? And what are they really excited about? Is it first and foremost the lifestyle, or is it first and foremost they're excited about your company and what you're doing and what you can do together? Yeah, but remote work hiring is not easy.
No,
it's like
hiring period is not easy.
Yeah, that's true. But thankfully there are a lot of remote job boards. And yeah, I won't plug my favorites, but I have favorites, so people can ask if they want. I don't want to hurt anyone else's feelings, but yeah.
No doubt. My guest today has been Marie Prokopets. Marie, thank you so much for coming on and sharing everything that you have with us today.
Yeah, I'm really happy to join, and I feel like I have so many more blog posts I have to write about management and all that. So thank you for those ideas, Brian.
Well, keep me posted, and thanks again.
Yeah, will do.
Okay, really enjoyed that conversation with Marie. Obviously going to link to that article right there in the show notes. So give that a little bit of your time today. There are lots more tips and things we didn't even get to in this interview. So lots of great stuff over there. Also, many of you know that I'm working on a tool specifically for remote teams to tackle some of these topics that have come up around communication and wellness and collaboration, etc. And so you can go over to projectheadlamp.com or projectheadlamp.com/remote-work-resources. I just published a big old batch of resources and lists and tools and articles for remote teams around wellness, management tips, training, remote tools for remote teams, job boards, all sorts of things like that. So hop over there, projectheadlamp.com. If you see something or if you know of something that I missed, then reach out to me and let me know. I'll take a look at it and see about getting it added to that resource there. So let's get to the closing thoughts on this interview. Right off the bat, just the importance of effective meetings. Extremely important for any and every business, nonprofit, family. Doesn't matter. Effective meetings are important, and like many things, the remote workplace just elevates that importance. And so, obviously, like best practices for meetings in general apply. Have an agenda, have a topic, et cetera, et cetera. But then, some specifics having to do with remote meetings. Just the idea of having the video on. It just, I'll be curious to hear some feedback from folks who have this policy, or don't, about making it a default assumption that yes, you will join the meeting. And your video will be on, because just like in real life, so much communication is not in the words, but in, how you say something, how you look when you say something. As the presenter, as the communicator, it is so helpful to get the visual cues from the person that you're speaking to, so that you can know how to adjust, what you're saying. And it feels like one of those things that could be a courtesy. And potentially even a requirement, and then documenting the outcome of that meeting. depending upon what your company's communication policy or communication guidelines are, documenting the outcome of that meeting either in a dedicated Slack channel or into a company wiki that's on Confluence or Notion or something like that. And by the way, one thing I am definitely learning, if you have remote team members and you don't have a communication guideline or policy with specific things laid out, you want to do that. Keep an eye on my Twitter account, BRHEA. I'm working on a presentation and a couple of additional resources right now around this specific topic. So keep your eye out. Hoping to have something out this week, if not by the end of next. The whole bit around experimenting with options. I'm sure you can kind of hear. I was like, I'm genuinely thinking through that myself. I am a person who does like routine and rhythm, and I do things to specifically strip options away from myself so that I don't even have the option to think or choose. So I think it is so important to experiment, figure out what works for you. However, too much, I don't know, maybe, and it just comes down to personality, doesn't it? And knowing yourself, but too much variability just keeps me from getting into the groove. I will say this. I mean, I work for myself. And so the nature of my work and my projects and what I might be working on in a given day fluctuates so significantly that, perhaps for me to add variability of context on top of it is maybe too much. If you are in a just, boom, boom, boom kind of rhythm with your work, and exactly what it is you're going to be doing, not only today, but tomorrow, next week, and probably the month after, then a huge benefit of remote work is, mix it up, work from wherever you want, change the way you get to work today, mode of transportation or whatever. And so, maybe that's what's going on there, is that I have found that experimentation with all of the options to be detrimental because my work is so variable. So maybe if you're not in that situation, then, have at it, my friend. I do like this idea of creating a fake commute, to build in the buffer. And so even if it is walking out of your door, walking up and down, walking around the block and then coming right back in home, just to give yourself that just little bit of margin between thinking about work, decompressing on it for a little bit, and then being home to your people, home to yourself, ready to rest, all of those benefits there. It is definitely, we got into this conversation about, the bad habits of work, the bad habits of overwork. And, the numbers bear this out. The majority of managers who are new to remote work, one of their top concerns, if not their top concern, is that their workers, their reports, quote unquote, not a huge fan of that word, but that's how it's often referred to, that they will not get their work done, or that they will not, they will not be doing enough work. The numbers bear out that actually remote workers work too many hours because, ironically, they are concerned about their managers thinking that they're slacking. And so this part of the conversation around overwork and remote workers working too many hours is something that leaders of remote teams need to pay extreme attention to, because it will lead to burnout. It will lead to your team members not showing up well-rested, rejuvenated, and ready to do their best and most creative work because they are too tired. And so great benefit of working remotely is that we use all these tools that are accessible anywhere and everywhere across all of our devices, and we're extremely good at being able to work on anything from anywhere, practically. The downside of that is that it means that you are accessible virtually anywhere you are. And you can be on vacation and within 5 minutes can basically be ready to do your job. That has not always been the case. That's for many people in many different industries, in many different professions. That it isn't the case. And so I believe it. I think it, I think that the statistics are identifying this, that the reason that most remote workers do work too many hours is because they can, and because from fear or guilt or, even like short-term, like high motivation, wanting to, I've definitely been in that position, wanting to work so many hours because a challenge that you're facing or a problem that you're trying to solve, it's invigorating. And so there are reasons, good and bad, for this. Leaders need to be modeling boundaries and need to be directly and explicitly communicating it is in your individual best interest and therefore ours as a team that we are all getting enough rest and that we are not overworking ourselves. The whole thing around like the contextual space, and we kind of started talking about, Marie has multiple places in her apartment that she can work from. There are many places in my home when I'm working from home that I like for one reason or another. And I'm kind of starting to think about this. I can't think specifically of his quote, but James Clear in Atomic Habits, he talks about the power of contextualizing a space to a mode of work, and talks about how, if you're trying to establish a new habit, one thing that can be very, very helpful is to have one space, one job. So I know when I sit in the blue chair in the corner of my living room, I'm working. I'm not like relaxing, reading a book, or that sort of thing. Should actually be the other way around. that there are only a few places in my home or in your apartment that are dedicated to work. There's plenty of research around this as well, that in general we're sleeping a lot, where we don't sleep as well as we could because we so often do work in our bed, because we can just throw our laptop in our lap and do work in bed. And so it's not that your bed is the place where your brain realizes, oh, hey, it's time for us to shut down and get some rest. That is a place where, well, we might veg out for a little bit. We might do some work. We might, whatever. And so that bit of it really got me thinking about, I should probably not work from the kitchen island ever again, even though I really like it, because that's where I should be chilling out and having conversations with my kids. Okay. And then I guess, a couple final thoughts here. I think it's just important to note that being remote, this whole thing about visibility and whether or not remote workers are less likely to be considered for a promotion. I think it's important to think about this if you're working remotely or if you are leading folks who are remote. Listen, whether or not that is fair is an entirely separate conversation. Whether or not it is fair that people who are visible are more likely to be considered, forget that. It's just probably true. And so it's important it's important for remote employees to be aware of this and to be good at sharing your work. It's not bragging. It's sharing and being sure that you remain top of mind. Now, for managers, I think what's important is to make that the process, and so that nobody feels awkward about it or feels less awkward about it, so that people who are not showing up in HQ, if you have some folks who are in an office and then some members of the team who are remote, that everybody has an opportunity to have their wins celebrated, has an opportunity to have their progress shared, and so. Because it is just got to be, it's just a fact that the face-to-face, in-person interaction of our beings as social animals is going to subconsciously play into those sorts of decisions. Again, whether or not that's fair and just is a separate conversation. If this is the playing field that you are on as an employee or as a manager, take that into consideration. Finally, I think that the word probably discipline more so than maturity there at the end of do you need to be more disciplined as a remote worker? I think you do. And therefore there are definitely some training and some hiring implications in that. Curious if anybody disagrees or has a different take on that. Let me know. I'm B-Ray, BRHEA on Twitter. Really enjoyed this conversation. Would love to hear what you all think about it. And one last thing, Heaton, take a vacation, man. You've earned it. I'll see y'all next week.